This is Terms of Reference podcast number 161.
Open data is really everywhere. You can find it when you're commuting to work. If you want to know how your government spends your money, there are limitless ways where open data is part of your life already, or at least should be.
This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. According to the May 6, 2017 issue of The Economist, data has officially displaced oil as the world's most valuable resource. If you're like me, the most surprising part of this declaration is that it's taken until now for this to appear. Data drives the business models of most, if not all, of the world's most valuable companies. Governments rely upon data for safety and security issues, and data availability is something so many of us take for granted when we're driving from our homes to an unfamiliar destination. As the world's most valuable resource, you'd think that data would be locked in safes, or hidden from view, or basically hoarded whenever possible. And you'd be correct. However, what we also know is that there is an absolutely mind-boggling amount of data that is publicly accessible, or open, for anyone to access and use. And there is a powerful movement, which continues to gain popularity, that seeks to unlock, set free, and make useful as much of the world's data as possible. My guest for the 161st Terms of Reference podcast, Pavel Richter, sits at one of the focal points of the open data movement. He is the CEO of Open Knowledge International, a worldwide nonprofit network of people passionate about openness, using technology to unlock information and enabling people to take action on pressing social problems. And Pavel is no newbie to open data. Before joining OKI, Pavel was executive director of Wikimedia Deutschland for 5 years, and he pioneered the internationally acclaimed Wikidata project, which is now the fastest growing project for open structured data. I'm sure you're going to enjoy our conversation, where we discuss topics such as what open data means, the ethics of open data, where open data lives, if open data is used for evil, and even how different cultures interpret what open means. I spoke with Pavel in Berlin. But before we get started, a quick word from our sponsor.
The Terms of Reference podcast is sponsored by International Solutions Group, helping to improve the social impact of governments, UN agencies, NGOs, and companies for more than 10 years. Visit ISG online at www.theisg.com.
Hello, Pavel. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hello, Stephen. Thank you for having me.
Pavel, I was going over your bio and doing some background, sort of research on you before our conversation, and you've been everywhere. And we actually, in our conversation before the show, you said that you used to be in Australia doing work here, and you kind of come through Bangkok here. Where are you sitting now, today?
Right now, I'm sitting in Berlin, the city I'm calling home for the last 10 years. To be more specific, I'm sitting in an office I've rented for today. And I'm overlooking Potsdamer Platz. Everyone who has ever been to Berlin knows where it is. Usually I work from home, but for today I have rented that space here.
Nice. I love it. Berlin in the springtime, I'm sure it's gorgeous.
Yeah, it's cold, rainy, and gray right now. So it used to be gorgeous, but right now, no, it's not. It's really, really cold.
You are the CEO of Open Knowledge International. And rather than having me fumble through what exactly Open Knowledge is, let's start with what is Open Knowledge and kind of take us through the different pieces of that organization.
Yeah. So I think Open Knowledge is at least two things. There is Open Knowledge International. That's an international organization based in the UK, a non-profit organization, which I'm the CEO of. But there is a second aspect to Open Knowledge, and that is Open Knowledge as a community and as a network of groups and people, individuals all over the world interested in caring for open data. I am, as I said, the CEO of Open Knowledge International, the organization. And our purpose, so to say, is that we are trying to empower other civil society organizations to use open data to improve people's lives. So I know that sounds kind of abstract. So let me just very briefly go into three aspects of that. The one part is that, if you want to say it that way, that our customers are other organizations. So we are working together with small and large civil society organizations all over the world who have an interest in using open data and I'm pretty sure we're going to come to what open data in particular is in a moment, but who are interested in using open data to help them with their mission. So if you are a human rights organization, for example, you have your standard repertoire of how to do your work. You might use petitions, you might use advocacy, you might use public relations, you might use demonstrations. So there are a lot of tools that you could use. And we here at Open Knowledge strongly believe that for a lot of these organizations, open data can be very beneficial. And we try to help these organizations to use open data. And how we're going to do this will probably be part of this podcast. The last aspect is to this, that we empower civil society organizations to use open data to improve people's lives, is actually the last part, the improve people's lives. So we actually try to be very reflective about that what we do is not only about being open, but being open for a particular effect. And the effect is that directly or indirectly, it needs to improve people's lives.
Gives us a lot to talk about. Let's start with the first question that you posed. What is open data?
Well, open data is any data set. So any kind of information that you can freely use, freely access, and freely combine with other information. Wow, that sounds really abstract.
I was just going to say it's super abstract. So, is this the dark net that I see on Mr. Robot, or is this something that governments are just sort of pumping out and it's just out there for us to use? Is this stuff from the United Nations? Where is all this open data?
Yeah, so let's just take a very hands-on example here. Google Maps is a great tool you can use, and it shows you you can use it for planning your route while traveling. You can look up an address and stuff like this. Google Maps is a great tool. There's another one called OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap does the exact same thing, provides you with maps, any kind of maps you want to use. Now, the big difference is that Google Maps is closed data and OpenStreetMap is open data. So OpenStreetMap is done and conducted by and filled by thousands and thousands of volunteers who actually spend their afternoons in mapping the world and giving us access to that kind of data. Now you could say, what, for me as the end user, what's a big difference? What difference does it make if it's open or closed? Well, there's a pretty big difference here, is that the open data is here to stay. So if Google ever decides that they don't want to go into Google Maps any longer, Google Maps will simply disappear. With OpenStreetMap, the data, the underlying information about the maps is licensed under a free license, can be used by everyone without asking for permission or at least paying a fee. So this data is here to stay. That's one huge important aspect of open data. The second one is you can take the data and do whatever you want to do with it. So you want to put a map on your website, you can use OpenStreetMap to do that. You can use the underlying data. If your business requires, for example, if you have a pizza delivery service and you want to show your customers where the pizza delivery guy is, you can use OpenStreetMap very freely to show people this without paying any royalty. So there is an economic value to it as well. The third aspect for this example on OpenStreetMap is that you can use it when there is no commercial benefit to it. So let me give you an example. Nepal was hit by a tremendous earthquake several years ago. That was a huge catastrophe in Nepal. It's pretty hard to get accurate maps in Nepal anyway, because this is not really what people are paying for. So there is no commercial value in having detailed maps of all streets in Nepal. So what happened right after the earthquake is that thousands of volunteers or hundreds of volunteers started to map every road in Nepal and map where roads are still accessible or where roads were destroyed, and put all this information on OpenStreetMap. So for relief services, for agencies who wanted to bring relief to the people of Nepal, that was a tremendous resource, something they would never find on Google Maps or any other commercial mapping service. So this is the third aspect here. So open data is really everywhere, and that is only one example. You can find it when you're commuting to work work. If you have an app that tells you when your bus is coming, that very often is based on open data. If you want to know how your government spends your money, open data is your friend. So you see there are limitless ways where open data is part of your life already, or at least should be.
It almost seems like it's a universe too large to really wrap your head around. I mean, is that part of the mission? I know you didn't say it's in your 3 bullet points there, but is that kind of part of the mission of what your organization is doing? Is it navigating that? Is it organizing it? Is it curating it in some way? Or is that not really even possible?
There are 2 aspects to that question. And one is the technical aspect. So we are talking about data. So we are talking about databases. We are talking about APIs. We are talking about access to these large data sets. And so there is a pretty big technical aspect to our work. Just to give you one example, a project called Open Trials. What Open Trials does is it collects all available information on pharmaceutical interventions. So most of the time it's medication and the trials around these medications. So as you know, if a new drug wants to be approved by the FDA or any other regulatory body, they need to go through rigorous testing. And that test data is usually published. It's published on some website, for example, of the FDA. It's very often published in a way that's not really useful. It might be, for example, in a PDF. A PDF is nice to read on the web, but if you want to take out the data and play around with it and analyze it, you can't do that in a PDF. So what we try to do with Open Trials is we try to pull all this data together in one large database and make it usable in a way that machines and programs and software can work with this. Why is that important? It's important, first of all, to give quick access to this information. So if there is a large outbreak of Ebola or the Zika virus, just to name the 2 very recent outbreaks that got some headlines, if we take these 2, it's very important for organizations on the ground to understand the kind of drugs that are in the testing cycle right now, to get access to that information so they can see what is coming and who they need to approach to get the latest drugs. But it's also very important from a scientific perspective. So if we have all this data together, we can see gaps, we can see mistakes, we can see and find errors in the data. So it's about increasing the data quality.
Has there been an instance where, let's just use this trials example, where people have also connected the dots and said, they've leapfrogged things, or they've said, wow, if we combine A and B, we're actually going to get to F faster?
So I don't have a concrete example for that, but isn't availability of data the fuel that drives academic research? If you provide that kind of resource, and I think that's one of the common themes about open data, is that you try to give people access and provide data, even if you don't really know what's going to happen with it. So this is not always done for a very specific purpose, but this is done within the spirit that if you provide data and access to data and high quality data and make that access easy and cheap or even free, then people will come and use it in ways that we as an organization cannot really foresee. So I don't see us as the gatekeepers and the ones who make a decision, this is now what needs to be done with the data. We are the ones who are laying the basis and the fundament for that use without actually determining what people will be end up using the data with.
So in the case of OpenStreetMaps or the trials data that you're talking about, obviously I appreciate that it's something that is a common license and it will live on past, and there's no commercial entity that can decide whether or not it gets shut down or turned on or what it's used for. Where does it live? Who pays for that? What server is it living on, or what farm is it living on that, it will exist into perpetuity? How does that aspect of it work?
That's a very interesting and very complex question. So first of all, there is, fortunately enough, hosting large amounts of data in itself is not very expensive. It used to be expensive, but right now, simply having the data there is cheap, is really, really cheap. What costs way much more money is giving people access to the data and paying for that access. So there are multiple business models here. Just to give you one example from a different open information and open data project, that's Wikipedia, of course, the largest, the only online encyclopedia available to people. Wikipedia's business model is very simple, asking the people who use it to pay for it. So once a year, Wikimedia has a global fundraising drive, and they ask people who are using Wikipedia, hey, why don't you give us some money to run this? And they're really, really successful with this. I think most of the funding needed for operating Wikipedia is generated by small donations, by people who actually use it. And that's a very innovative model. And other organizations like newspapers are trying that exact approach right now, trying to get their readers to donate, not to have a subscription, but to donate for the usage of that information. So I think it started as a kind of fringe business model, but it can be really successful if, of course, you have a large enough user base that is able and willing to pay voluntarily for that use. The second business model, and that is what we as an organization do, is we rely on grants by other large foundations. So be it the Omidyar Network, the Hewlett Foundation, the Sloan Foundation, the Arnold Foundation. A lot of large foundations are supporting our work and providing us with grants. But of course, what we try to do as an organization, and we can speak about this in more detail if you want, we are trying to find sustainable business models that would enable us and will enable us to provide for our work, even if larger foundations are not supporting a particular line of work.
I want to spin back for a second, and it's really easy, especially in the universe that you and I operate in, to think, hey, you know what, there's this open data out there, it's available, and so you've got OpenStreetMaps, you've got, the trials example that you put out there, there's GitHub, there's who knows how many different open source software projects are happening out there. Open source solutions and open data has been a theme on this podcast a couple of times. What about the fact that this open data is also available for nefarious purposes? Is that something that is considered, and is there a thought process behind that in your organization or in the community? I mean, is ISIS looking at this data, OpenStreetMaps, and thinking, how can we plan our next move?
I mean, I would be, of course, yes.
I don't mean to throw you like a massive curveball here, but I'm wondering, is that something that obviously you think of as an organization?
If you put something out and you put a big label on it, and the label says, look, this is really great, this is really free, you don't have to ask anyone, please feel free to use it. Everyone can use it. And that means people with bad intentions can use it as well. So I don't really think that ISIS cares so much about copyright and free licenses. So they probably couldn't care less about if they use a closed data set like Google Maps or an open one like OpenStreetMap. But of course, the data is available for everyone and therefore can be misused. There is no way out of this, quite frankly. There is, at the moment you're trying to stop this as an organization, then you're closing the data, and then it is not truly open data. So there are two avenues to this. There are two, not solutions, but ways to contain it. One is it's the job of the state to police this. So this is a policing question. This is a policy question that the state, as the government, needs to address and needs to think about. And the second aspect is that we as a society have to accept that if you are open to the enemies of openness as well. I mean, isn't that the same problem with democracy, with free speech? If you say that free speech is important, then the free speech is applicable also for people who are advocating against free speech. And they're using the same right to say horrible things about and push conspiracy theories and stuff like this. So there is a price for openness, and the price is that the openness can be misused. But that shouldn't really mean that the openness is the problem. It's how we as a society and how our governments and we as people are actually educating ourselves and dealing with that. But there is no way around it except for not being open. But I'd rather live in an open society than in a closed one.
I really appreciate that answer, especially in the times in which we're recording this. It seems that we need more of that thinking. And, it wasn't really, my question wasn't really aimed at, whether or not we should have open data. It was really more of like where the use is. But then as I thought during your answer a little bit more about my question as well, how nefarious is closed data use as well? I mean, how has Facebook manipulated for, recruiting on ISIS? We know that that's the thing that's happening. And, how has Home Depot, for the lack of a better example, used to build, the homemade bomb or something like that? You know what I mean? So it's even commercial closed systems are vulnerable to nefarious uses as well. So it's really not even a big problem of open data, right? It's about the systems that you're living in.
Yeah. Just to give you one example from Sweden. In Sweden, it's very common that, so in Sweden, everybody's tax returns are open. I mean, given the lack of open tax returns by the current president of the United States, that might be a way forward for the US as well. But so Sweden does this. Sweden publishes all tax returns of every citizen. That's a choice the Swedish people have done. It's something we would never do, for example, in Germany, because it would be very contrary to our culture. But it is very much in line with the culture in Sweden. So this comes down to a society and decision society do make based on their own culture and their own what they feel they are comfortable with. And what we define as openness might be very contrary in different cultures, but what other cultures see as open might be very contrary to what I believe should be open within my own cultural context. So I think we do have to recognize the cultural context of people when we are speaking about openness. And there is no general rule or general global answer to that.
Bringing us kind of back into focus here on how we improve the social sector, how we empower social entrepreneurs and the development and aid world. You spoke earlier about OpenStreetMaps again and how it was used in Nepal to quickly map areas where roads worked and whatnot. How else is open data and structuring open data and making it accessible, how else is that changing the landscape for organizations who are seeking to do good in the world, who are seeking to lift people out of poverty or work on gender issues and these kinds of things? Are there other critical examples you'd like to point to about how this is changing the game?
Yeah, if you don't mind if I'm using again an example from Nepal. It's a very different one. So we spoke about Nepal in the context of the earthquake and mapping. But there's another interesting aspect here in Nepal. About 20% of the budget of Nepal are based on foreign aid. And so that's a lot, of course. And people in Nepal said a lot of outside influence is coming with that money. So we as the people would like to understand exactly where the money comes from and how that money is spent. So we are now entering in a huge area for open data, and that is spending data and budget data. So that we as citizens want to understand where the money is coming from, but also where the money is going to. And I don't know if you have ever had a look at the budget of the United States or the budget of Nigeria. These are hugely complex data sets and complex documents, which are really hard to understand and grasp. So a key aspect here is to make the spending visible and make it visible and understandable to people who are not experts in how to use budget data. And that is done, for example, through open spending. And when we come back to example in Nepal, they were collecting the data and are still collecting the data on who actually is providing foreign aid to Nepal and how is that money spent. They do so in a way that is accessible and understandable to laymen, to people who are not budget experts. And I think that brings us to a second most important non-technical aspect of our work. That is actually to help people develop their skills on how to use data. Because if you're a journalist and you want to cover the budget of your country, you're probably not interested in becoming an expert in data, an expert data wrangler or data visualization guy. But you want to understand what data is and how you access it and how you can present it in a way and analyze it in a way that is meaningful to first you and then your readers. And providing these skills and tools skills is the second big aspect, which we here at Open Knowledge call School of Data, but which is happening all over the openness movement, is to actually develop these skill sets and help people develop their own understanding on what to use and how to use that open data.
So you've been a part of this open data world for a while, and I'm wondering, how did the Wikipedia experience? You were the executive director of Wikimedia in Deutschland, or in Germany.
Yes.
For us non-German speakers. How did that experience prepare you for where you're at right now? Was it, where you're at right now, is it kind of a next logical step, or was there a new opportunity with open knowledge that you were seeking and you kind of came to your, you kind of plateaued at Wikimedia? Or take us through that story for yourself about, I'm interested because your profile starts with that private sector world, right, where you were a management consultant, you were in IT, you were in banking, where it's classic closed data, right? I mean, the last people in the world who want open data are banks. How has this prepared you for where you're at today? Sort of what were those breakthrough moments for yourself?
Oh, of course, that's a pretty complex question. But my personal journey, really my professional journey, starts as an IT consultant and later as a manager in consulting companies. And I was very much focusing on a very specific area of work that is risk management in banks and later on larger IT projects. So that was that has nothing to do with open data, of course. But after 12 years of this consultant work, I really thought, so I came to a point where probably we all have been in one moment or another. Is this really what gets me up in the morning to improve the balance sheet of a bank by a very, very tiny margin? Is this really what I want to spend my knowledge and my know-how on? And I decided no, I wanted to make a pretty radical shift. And I was very clear that I wanted to work in the non-profit world, because it's way more meaningful to myself. So it really, I'm very passionate about working in an environment where the bottom line is not the most important thing, but making an impact on the world and helping making that impact. So the nonprofit sector was pretty clear for me that's where I wanted to go. And I ended up with Wikimedia not by accident, but I was a Wikipedian long before I started working for Wikimedia. So I was actually writing the encyclopedia, mostly in German. When I was sitting during my consulting jobs, when I was sitting in hotel rooms, that's how I spent my evenings, writing and contributing to Wikipedia. So when Wikimedia Germany were looking for an executive director, I mean, that was the perfect storm for me, a dream come true. I wanted to work in management and nonprofits, and I could do this around something I really cared for very deeply, which is Wikipedia. So I did this for 5 years. And moving on to open knowledge was actually personally a very logical step, because I was working for Wikimedia Germany, as it already says, that's very local. Even so, it was a pretty big organization. It was focusing on Germany. And Open Knowledge International, again, as the name points out, is very much an international organization. So it really gave me the opportunity to work on a global scale. And that's what I'm doing. We are a virtual organization. Me and my staff are distributed all over the world. We are all working from co-working spaces or rented offices like this one for a day or from home. The international aspect of that work was really my personal driver. And I think going from Wikipedia to open data really is going from a great use case to infrastructure. This is really about the nuts and bolts, the pipelines of the openness movement. And focusing on open data and the technical aspects is really about, it's not as shiny. And I honestly, I struggle when I'm on at a dinner or so, and people ask me, what are you doing? When I said I was working for Wikimedia, everybody immediately understood. It's a little bit harder to explain what open knowledge does, but I think it's very, very meaningful in ways, because it really lays the groundwork and it enables and it empowers. And it's not only about one particular use case of open data, which was Wikipedia.
What is the next 3 to 5 years of open data, especially now that you're sitting at the table directing an organization that is the nuts and bolts, right? The foundation, the infrastructure portion of this. Is it new data platforms? Is it sustainable funding models? Is it energizing communities? What are the key aspects of where you need to push in order to continue to breathe sustainability and scalability and, energy around the open data movement?
So
I hope it wasn't that heavy of a question.
No, it's not. I'm simply a little bit careful in making and giving a prognosis, especially when it concerns the future, because honestly, what's going to happen in everything related to the internet and tech within the next 3 to 5 years, I think it's a very broad horizon. So I am really reluctant to put a timeline on it, but I'm way more comfortable in speaking on what I think are the coming large issues. So for organizations like ours, like Open Knowledge and like-minded organizations, I really think it is about figuring out who the actual end user of that open data is. For a long time, we were all trying to sell the idea of there is this great app everybody can use in the street that will improve people's lives. There are examples of these, and I used one in our conversation about OpenStreetMap, which is really used by a lot of people on their mobile phones. But I believe for us as an organization, it's more about a focus on how data is actually used and by whom it is used. So for us as an organization, the answer is pretty clear. It's by other civil society organizations. These are our partners and our customers. But it is also to actually showing that open data has a benefit, because if a government, and it's still governments who are the largest producer of data and therefore the largest potential providers of open data, there is a cost involved for a government to open up data. It's a direct cost of simply spending tax money on it, but an indirect cost as well. It needs to be maintained. They need to remove obstacles and so on. They need to change their own workings. So all these are costs to governments. And I think we as civil society organizations have to show that there is a value in it and that there is a benefit in opening data. We have to keep our side of the bargain, so to say. When we said that open the data and it will be used, we have to show how it's used and we have to make it used. So that's a big important aspect for us. I think the second one is keeping the world open. So for quite a while, openness was a very trendy thing. And especially a lot of Western governments were publishing data like in the US with data.gov or in the UK, data.gov.uk. So a large data portal. Data was made available. And I am afraid that we see a pushback that might not be against open data per se, but that comes in the wake of a general notion of governments closing and governments not being as open and as vocal and as accessible as they used to be. So I think we took openness for granted in Western democracies. And I'm not quite sure if this is really true any longer. And so, for example, there is a big push in the scientific community to rescue and save data, to simply make sure that data that is currently available on government-run data portals, it's copied and stored outside of the reach of governments. That might just now be a precaution, but better be safe than sorry, I'd say. So that, I think, is an important aspect.
So we're talking about, what the future looks like. What's the general open state of the world? I have many friends in the humanitarian world who are just, they are evangelists for open data. I have other friends in the commercial world who said, open's great, but, commercial's important. There is, a political climate right now that might be seeing things close. What's the state of openness in the world, and what do you think that things look like?
As I said, I see a tremendous risk that especially Western democracies becoming less open, given the current political climate. But the current data actually is pretty optimistic, I'd say, about the general state of openness. So there are many ways so it's pretty hard to measure openness in general and to come up with the one standard that captures it all. There is, for example, the Web Foundation runs something called the Open Data Barometer, where they measure openness. And we as an organization have something called the Global Open Data Index, which we just released in its fourth installment just a couple of days ago. And what we try to measure here is we have 15 different categories be it government budget, be it national laws, be it land ownership. So 15 dimensions where we see how open are the data sets in these categories. And we do this for currently, let me look, 94 countries. So number one is currently Australia and Taiwan. They are both sharing the first place as the most open countries in the world. And the least open ones are Barbados and Myanmar. And in between, there is a huge variety, of course. But what we see is that there are certain aspects of openness like government budgets, which are really, really open throughout the world. So even place 53, the Philippines, has pretty good scoring in terms of government budget. So that is data that is readily available. And we as civil society organizations can make really, really good use of. The other aspect, for example, land ownership. So who is actually owning the land of a country? That is something where nearly no country is providing any open data. There are exceptions, of course. Denmark is pretty good in terms of land ownership, but even Australia and Taiwan are pretty dire when it comes to making that data available. So, and that's probably not a coincidence. So there are political interests here in play on why land ownership is not publicly available data. But I think it should be. I think we as citizens have a right to understand who owns the land we are living on. Who are the owners of land, actually? It's important for us in industrialized countries, but it's, of course, important for developing countries as well to understand this. So what I'm saying here is there are areas where data is really readily available, but there are other aspects where data is not very available. And tracking that availability through various instruments like the Global Open Data Index or the Barometer is really important because it can help people on the ground. We are a tiny organization. We have like 40 people on staff and a 3 million budget. We are not going to do a global advocacy campaign for open data. This is something that citizens need to engage with. And I think that's the important aspect for how open data is made good use for. It's citizens through organizations usually. Citizens in terms of academia, citizens in terms of journalists, of activists, of patient right groups, of land ownership groups, whatever. Citizens organizing themselves and pushing for openness. And once data is open, making good use of it and using data in a way that actually has an impact on the ground. That cannot be done by global organizations. That can only happen by communities and by activists and by people, actually, by us. So it's not what open data can do for you. It's what you can do with open data. That's really important.
Awesome. I appreciate that call to action. I think it's critical, and it's something that so much of what we do in the development world, humanitarian aid world, the underlying factor there is, the citizen has to take action. But we come back to what you were talking about earlier. You are an organization. You do need to, you need to keep the fire warm. What are some of the sustainable funding models that you're considering right now to move some of your budget away from, essentially donor-based grants and those kinds of things? Or what are the unique ways in which you're looking for funding?
First of all, let me be very clear. Grants from foundations will always be a very significant part of our budget. And I think they are important. And I think more and more foundations are learning and understanding that supporting that kind of groundwork around data is actually having an impact on their own missions. So there's nothing bad about these kind of grants. We like them, and we will continue. This will continue to be a very important part of our funding. But of course, simply to spread the risk, but also to use the opportunity, we are looking at different opportunities. And one is actually a commercial one. We as Open Knowledge International are the owners of a commercial company called Viderum, who are providing commercial services to governments, to large corporations who actually want to open data and who want to have consultancy, need technical services, need reliable reliable services to make data available, make open data available. So this is about open data, but it's about providing services and hosting and consulting business around using open data, specifically for large corporations and for governments. That's an interesting aspect for us. It's something that, so we developed a software called CCAN, which is really running most of the large and small data portals in this world. And so developing a consulting and service business around that software, which is of course open source and will always be open source, but developing that kind of a business model is a very interesting aspect for us as a non-profit organization to receive funding from a for-profit company that we are controlling.
Last question I have for you, and it's unfortunate it's the last question because obviously we could probably talk for the next 3 hours. Is data science the critical skill of the future for everyone? And sort of the second part to that question is, we're not all super data geeks, right? Some people's brains just don't work in databases and they don't work with technology. What's the best way for those people to take advantage of the promise of open data that you're describing here?
There's a debate going on in Germany right now if we should drop classical Greek from the curriculum and replace it with programming, because every pupil needs to learn programming. I don't agree. I think it's not necessary. I'm not a software developer. I can't program. I can't write code. And I think it's the same is true with data. No, you don't need to be a data scientist, but what you need to have is what I call data literacy. You need to understand to read and make sense of data. Like you need literacy and you need to be able to write and talk. And like you learn a language, you need to understand. Like you learn math, you don't need to be a scientist. Don't need to be on that level. But I think everybody here needs, I wouldn't call it basic understanding. I would call it literacy in all terms technical, because this is way too important to leave it to the expert. If we rely only on scientists and people who have deep knowledge, then we are screwed, because it has such a big impact on how we are living and how we are governed and how we are spending money, that we need to understand, we need to be literate in it. So what does it mean for you if you're now on the ground and you say, yeah, I really want to understand how my local budget is constructed and spent on. Do I need to go to open spending website and look it up? So the great thing about open data is that there is a very interesting and very welcoming and nice community of geeks out there, people who are really into data and who love to work with people who are into improving people's lives, and matching these two groups together. So the people who have the deep technical knowledge on what to do with data and how to access it and how to wrangle it and how to normalize it, and bringing these together with the activists who want to get better health services in their communities, who want to fight corruption, who want to fight human rights abuse, or who want to improve the environment, and getting these together and building a bridge between these two groups. I think that's a key aspect of making an impact through open data. And that's what we as an organization and other organizations too are trying to do right now. That's what I mean when I said we need to keep our side of the bargain, is to bridge that gap between the people who could make the best use of the data and the people who actually understand how to work with data. And that's the mission for the future.
I love it. Pavel, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time today to talk to us, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for having me, and let openness come true.
Hey there, thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this conversation with Pavel, and if you're finding value in the Terms of Reference podcast overall, do me a favor and give us a rating on iTunes or whatever podcast app you happen to be using right now. And if you really like the episode, share it with your friends. Put it on Twitter, put it on Facebook. And of course, you can always ask us a question on the website as well. Thanks. You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from Aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.